We are interviewing Jim Branson, born on November 28, 1964. He was in the U.S. Army and the Missouri National Guard. He served in Kuwait and Iraq. Highest rank achieved was Lieutenant Colonel 05. We are here at Elias Catholic High School in Jefferson City, Missouri. My name is Gavin Branson and my co-interviewer is Zane Henderson.
Colonel Branson, where are you from and where did you go to high school?
First of all, Zane and Gavin, thanks for taking the time to interview me. I grew up in a small community of Bland, Missouri, and from there we moved to Sedalia, Missouri, and I eventually moved to Jefferson City and graduated in 1983 from Jefferson City High School.
Can you tell us about your family history, mother, father, and siblings?
Sure. My mother and father, they worked in shoe factories in Bland, and that's what moved us around the state of Missouri. And basically that's how we ended up in Jefferson City. After the shoe factory started closing throughout the Missouri, we ended up in Jeff City, and my dad went to work for ABB, and I went to high school here in the capital city.
Do you have any family members that served in the military besides yourself?
Yeah, I did. My dad served in World War II very proudly. He very rarely talked about his combat time in World War II. He stayed after the war, and he called himself a railroad MP. So therefore what he did is they collected Nazi POWs that were trying to flee the countryside, and he primarily was in Italy, Leghorn, and so they would collect up the Germans, the POWs, and move them back into Germany into POW camps. I'm very proud of my dad's service in World War II. I have two uncles that served in the military as well. One retired as a 06, a full-bird colonel. He was a surgeon. And my other uncle had a tour in Korea and two tours in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne Division, and he retired with 37 years, and he was a DeVarty Command Sergeant Major of the 101st Airborne.
When you were in high school, did you ever believe that you'd be a part of the military? If so, why did you believe this?
Absolutely. Growing up as a child, my dad always referred to the fact that when you get in the Army, or when you go to the Army, so if I wouldn't make my bed right at night when I woke up, or in the morning when I woke up, he would say, you know, when you get in the Army, son, you're going to learn how this works. So absolutely, I just thought that it was something that everybody did. And when you got 18 years old, you signed up for the Army. That's obviously what I did is I signed up at 18, and really glad that I did that.
What branch of the service were you a part of?
I was part of the Army. Started out as an Army enlisted soldier, and then became commissioned. And during that transition, when I was in the University of Missouri Columbia, I was in U.S. Army Reserves. Commissioned, back on active duty, and then eventually ended up in the Army National Guard.
Where was your basic training?
Basic training was in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri.
What was your job as an enlisted soldier?
I was a 91 Alpha, which was a medic.
Where was your first assignment?
My first assignment was with the 3rd of the 7th Infantry in Fort Benning, Georgia, Cotton Balers. It's part of the 18th Airborne Corps, the 197th Infantry Brigade, which was a separate brigade for the 18th Airborne Corps.
Can you briefly give us a story about your enlisted time?
Sure, absolutely. What's funny is most of the training you get in basic training is light infantry skills. So, you know, you throw on a rucksack, you have a harness, it's called an LBE, and light infantry, M16, you know, no tanks, no armored personnel carriers, no vehicles. So basically you're out in the woods learning how to be an infantryman with no vehicles. So when I showed up to my first assignment, I got there and they told me this afternoon, I had like 3 hours to get ready. They said, you need to go to the central issuing facility and draw your equipment. So that's my rucksack, canteens, everything that needs to go together. All that stuff is loose, so you got to put it together and then tape it up. The straps you tape up so they don't rattle and make noise. And in basic training, we took days to perfect this, because when you're carrying all this weight, you want to make sure that everything fits perfectly on you. So I had just a few hours to get my TA-50 and rucksack together. I put that together and showed back up at the unit very hastily, and they told me we were going on a 40-kilometer road march. So the longest that I had ever been carrying a rucksack was 13 miles. That's a requirement for basic training back then, is that you had to go on a forced road march for 13 miles and get in under a certain amount of time. So when I showed up at the unit, I had no idea how I was going to go 40 kilometers in one night. I mean, that's pretty scary to think that you're brand new to the unit, and when one night you're going to go 40 kilometers. So I was very scared about that. So I started throwing things out of our rucksack. So we're going for 2 weeks, so I packed 1 pair of BDUs, 6 pair of socks, and the boots I had on and a pair, 6 pair of underwear and t-shirts. And that's basically all that I had for 2 weeks. So I get in the car with someone that was there at the unit that was going to drive me out to the start point of the road march. And I showed up, and lo and behold, there's Armored Personnel Carriers 113s. I didn't realize I'd been assigned to a mechanized infantry brigade. So everybody looks at me and they're like, where's your gear? Where's your equipment? And I held up my rucksack and they're like, we're going into the field for 2 weeks. Is that all you've got? I'm looking in the back of this 113 of my squad, and there's actually a TV setting in there, and these guys have all kinds of snacks and everything you can imagine loaded up. And here I am with just a rucksack. So that was a relief, and that was a really good night that we went 40 kilometers and I didn't have to walk it.
How did you become an officer?
After my enlisted time was up, I decided that I would go to college. I went to Lincoln University here in Jefferson City, Missouri. They had an ROTC program, and I thought, that might be something I should check out. So what I found out is if I joined ROTC, that not only would I have my GI Bill, I would also have some subsistence from ROTC. And they told me since I was enlisted, I could become an officer in 2 years. Now, to be an officer, you're supposed to have a college degree. So what would happen is I would get my commission as a second lieutenant in 2 years. I would be required to stay in the Army Reserves or National Guard for another 2 years till I got my degree, and then I could go back on active duty or the Reserves or National Guard. So that's what I did, is I really enjoyed my time in ROTC. It was a great experience. It gave me money for school, and in 2 years I became commissioned, and I transferred to the University of Missouri-Columbia. And at that point in time, I joined the 5503rd U.S. Army Hospital in Columbia, and was in that until I got commissioned, until I got my degree.
So do you think that being an enlisted soldier made you a better officer?
Absolutely. I think that it really helped out. I think that you can be a very effective officer without being enlisted first, but I think it gave me an advantage. I'm more of a hands-on type of guy, so when I was with soldiers in the motor pool, I was one of those officers that was crawling under the vehicle and taking a look at what's going on, and that's just the way that I preferred to command troops, is to be with them, be in the field, and I think that it really helped out that I was enlisted first.
What was happening in the world when you were in the military?
Well, when I first got in the military, there was a small skirmish called Grenada, and The 82nd Airborne went down to Grenada, and it was basically a real short operation. You know, it's really something I wish I could have been involved with, but I wasn't. So we had Grenada and then Panama, where we removed Noriega. And I managed to get to Panama shortly after that conflict, and you know, got a chance to see the countryside there. And then, of course, you know, we had Somalia, the first Desert Storm, and then the OIF and OEF.
Did you serve overseas during your military service?
Yes, I did. I served in numerous places overseas. I was very lucky to be stationed at Fort Shafter Flats in Hawaii, an absolutely beautiful place. Even though it's part of the United States, it's considered an overseas assignment. I was at Camp Carroll, Korea, Grafenwehr, Germany, and then I spent some time in Japan at Chitose. And again, we mentioned Panama, so that's something that I absolutely wouldn't give anything. Just loved the chance of getting out and seeing different things. And then, of course, in the travels of going to different places, you know, there's some layovers where you can maybe do some things. So, you know, in my travels back and forth to Iraq, I often joke around that I've been to Ireland 5 times, but never got out of the airport.
What unit did you serve with in Iraq?
I served with what's called MNDB, Multinational Division Baghdad. And that was originally commanded by, when I got there on the ground, by Major General Joseph Phil of the 1st Cavalry Division. Over time, the division headquarters moved out, and it was the 4th Infantry Division commanded by Major General Jeffrey Hammond. MNDB was one of the largest divisions ever formed on the face of the earth, and that was during the surge. So my time in Iraq was during that time frame of the surge, and that's when people were getting extended time, and they were staying there longer. And it was basically a time that we were trying to eradicate the insurgents in Iraq. Specifically, okay, so that was the division headquarters that we reported to. Specifically, I was in the 35th Engineer Brigade. So the 35th Engineer Brigade consists of 3 battalions. Okay, so I was in the headquarters of that. And the 3 battalions, one is a horizontal construction battalion. And what horizontal construction means, that's all the dozers and backhoes and the people that are basically operators that move the earth. Okay, the 2nd battalion is a vertical construction battalion, and so that's your plumbers, your carpenters, electricians, and so forth. So they actually build structures. Okay, so those guys were great, and they were all National Guard troops. So it was really a good thing. I had a 2-star general talk to me, and he said, you know, the engineer battalion or brigade is a really good fit here in Iraq because you're bringing to us union carpenters, union electrician, union plumbers, and those guys really know their jobs. And basically, they don't have to worry about being out here trying to fight the enemy. They have to worry about getting their jobs done. And so the square footage of buildings and stuff that we were able to put up was astronomical compared to rotations prior to us, and it's just stuff that people do every day. The other battalion that we had, the 3rd Battalion, was a combat engineer battalion, and that was the IED hunters. So what their jobs were, it was all of Baghdad. We were the general support for trying to get teams out 24/7. There was team out on the road looking for IEDs. So those guys would go out for as long as 8 hours a day looking for IEDs, and when they would come in, another team would go out. So it was quite a large area to cover. You know, we lost 10 soldiers over there in the brigade. and 9 of those were due to route clearance missions of running across IEDs and having something go wrong from that standpoint.
So what was your job?
My job was I was the electronics and communications officer, automation, and electronic warfare officer for the brigade. So all those battalions, I worked for them, and there was people that also did my job, but at the lower level. So I kind of oversaw all 3 of those battalions, and so obviously when it gets to the vertical and horizontal construction companies and battalion, and that was primarily communications, to make sure that if they were out in Baghdad, that if they got in trouble, they could call back and we could send help. So that's mainly radios, communications, and then we took care of their automation needs. When it came to the route clearance battalion, the IED hunters, that was a whole different thing. That's where the electronic warfare come into play. So what we try to do is, first of all, is if they're out in Baghdad, we have to make sure that we can communicate with them. If they get in trouble or need help, that they can call for support. You know, if they get into an ambush situation, that we can get them an F-15 or an Apache or something to help them out, or maybe an infantry unit that's close by. Another forward operations base could send somebody in to help them out. And then obviously medevac type situations. The electronic warfare portion of it, that's the very interesting thing, and that's how we try to defeat, once we come upon an IED or try to find an IED, of trying to defeat it electronically so it doesn't fire off. So an IED can be fired off in a couple different ways. One is by a command line. So people would take like a computer cable, and it usually comes in boxes of like 1,000 feet. So they would roll that out and have a switch at the end of it. So they would be off like 1,000 feet away, and then when they'd see the convoy coming, obviously they push the button and the IED fires off into the vehicle. That's a very simple way. It's kind of crude. The enemy got scared of that because you have to be so close to the route clearance team as it comes by, and they were afraid that they would be chased down and caught. So as time went on and insurgents started coming in, when I say insurgents, that's people from other countries came to fight this war. So basically, one of the things that I should probably explain is in 2007, 8, and 9, in that time frame, we had defeated the Iraqi army, and that's not who we were fighting at that point in time. We were basically just fighting splinter cells of Al-Qaeda and AQI and different people that would come in from different countries from all over, just Muslim countries that wanted to fight the United States and keep the United States out of the Middle East. So that kind of brought some smart people into the play. So what they started doing is they started detonating IEDs by cell phones. So you take a disposable cell phone, you hook it up to an IED, and when it rings, guess what? It triggers the IED. So that's the way it started. Is they'd call a number, and once it rang, the IED would go off. Okay. Then they got a little smarter. Then what they would do is you can imagine, you know, when you go through a garage door, and there's you have the infrared beam at the bottom, which makes the garage door go up. So what they did is they started building circuits to where they could see a route clearance team coming, or just a military convoy coming. And what they would do is they would call that cell phone up, and they would detonate, not detonate, but trigger that IED. So now it's in a ready state, okay? Then when a vehicle passes over that infrared beam, that's when it would fire. Okay, so usually what would happen in a route clearance team is we would have the most indestructible vehicle up front, which was called a Husky, and it was hard to hit and hard to penetrate. So again, they got smarter and built logic in to say, wait for the third vehicles. So if you can imagine going through a garage door, and say go through 3 times, let the 3 vehicles pass, then fire. So there's different things that we had. So we could had some equipment that could sense infrared type devices. We had other things where we could take a look. It was a camera that we could look at and maybe see if we could see HME, that's homemade explosives, or C4. And you have to understand that an IED laying on the side of the road, it's hard to see. A lot of times what these guys did is they would use like plaster, and there was chunks of concrete. If you can imagine out here on the streets, there's curbs everywhere and concrete. Well, over there with all the bombing and just the tanks, there was chunks of concrete all around. And so what they would do is a lot of these, they would make them look like a chunk of concrete laying on the side of the road. And so you had to, the rock clearance guys got real good at trying to figure out, what was the difference between a chunk of concrete and something that looks like one. And then obviously there's other types of I wouldn't call it an IED, but they would just take a culvert that goes under a road and pack it full of HME, homemade explosives, and then when the convoy would go over, that culvert would blow up. And a lot of times there was so much, the explosion was so bad that it was more the concussion that, of the bomb going off that would kill the people than it was shrapnel.
What were your living conditions like in Iraq?
Absolutely wonderful. Again, I got there in 2007, so there had been a lot of work done. I was very, very fortunate that I was on Victory Base Camp. And Victory Base Camp was where Saddam lived. It was the Al-Fal Palace, and the Victory over America Palace was there. Baghdad International Airport was right there. So basically what they did is they quarantined off like 7 miles long and probably 2 or 3 miles wide, and there was 10 base camps surrounding the Baghdad International Airport for security. That's where all the big planes flew in for supplies. So when I got there, they had, it's a Connex, and what a Connex is it's like a shipping container, and they split those into 3 rooms. And since I was an officer, I had a room to myself. And it was great, and a very short walk to the latrine, so we had running water, toilets. Now the guys, still in 2007, the guys out in the FOBs, forward operating bases, their living conditions weren't that great. And most of those guys, they would get stuck out there for a couple weeks at a time, then they would rotate them in and bring them back in. That was mainly the infantry troops. Now, the engineers, we pretty much came home every night. When I say home, we came back to Victory Base Camp. Specifically, Camp Liberty was where we were at. Camp Liberty was one of the 10 bases. The chow hall that we ate in was called the Flurry. The engineers ran it. KBR, Kellogg, Brown and Root was a huge company. They did all the cooking for us, and gentlemen, it was great. Friday night we had steaks and we had seafood. We even had Baskin Robbins ice cream. So we all joked about it, is once you leave the wire, what we call the wire, once we leave the base camp, you get out, you don't know if you're going to come back home. You don't know if you're going to get hit by an IED or get into an ambush, but once we made it back in, we had great living conditions. There was even Pizza Hut, Burger King, and we had a coffee shop on, we could go and pay. So it was just kind of like our own little city there, and it kind of help you cope with things while you were there.
From your time in the service, could you give us 4 or 5 things that you remember vividly even today?
Sure. Obviously, we went to Iraq, And what's very unfortunate is that when we came back, we were missing 10 soldiers. And those soldiers most of them had families. And there's a couple specific soldiers that, that come to mind that we lost. You would think that the IEDs got most of our guys, but my experience was never on a route clearance mission where we lost anyone. It was never on a route clearance mission where we had an IED go off. A lot of times I sat in the operations center, and we had drones that were over air, and we could see a lot of what was going on in Baghdad, so we could get different feeds up on the screens. So once in a while I would go outside the wire and see how things were going, but the biggest threat for me as an individual was something called indirect fire. Okay, so that is rockets and mortars. That's something that can be fired off from miles away. So one of the largest mass casualty event in 2007 happened on October 10th. Okay, and you have to remember this, we're one day ahead of the United States. So in some accounts, if you look this up, it says it happened on the 10th. In other accounts, it says November 11th. And it's because of the difference of where you're reporting it from, whether you're reporting it from Iraq or from the United States. But Victory, or Camp Liberty, I was walking out of the DeFleury Chow Hall. I just got through eating, and I was walking along, and all of a sudden I started hearing rockets. It's just an amazing thing, the Doppler effect, when you hear something that big coming through the air that fast. You could hear a whistle. And first of all, I guess what I should say is the base camp, Victory Base Camp, and most base camps are built up with what we call T-walls. And T-walls are like a Jersey barrier. So when you're driving down the road, those Jersey barriers separate the lanes. We had those that were 12 foot tall. So the base camp has sections. So like where you live at will be surrounded with 12-foot T-walls. And then the chow hall, 12-foot T-walls. And in different places, they would take concrete culverts, maybe 8 foot tall, like concrete bunkers, just sitting there in case we got indirect fire, rockets. We had a place to retreat to. So I'm walking out of the chow hall, I hear the whistle. We had another device called a CRAM, or a phalanx device, and it was developed by the Navy, and what that was for is to try to shoot the rockets and mortars out of the air before they actually got to us. And phalanx started going off, it started firing and trying to knock these things out of the air. And I stepped right behind a T-wall, just got right behind a T-wall before the first one went off. And then there was a series of, I can't even remember how many went off, but just a series of explosions. And, just we're talking 100 foot away from impact, and just the loudness. It's the loudest thing you'll ever hear in your life is when you have a rocket or a mortar go off. And, when you watch TV, people are talking to each other when all this is going on. I mean, your hearing just pretty much goes out. The concussion, you can just feel it in your chest as these things are hitting. And so I basically call that one step from death that night is when I just got behind the T-wall as the first one hit. So obviously when it stops, when something like that stops, you're not sure if it's done, you don't know, it's just a moment of silence. It just seems like everyone went silent for, I don't know how long, it could have been 5 seconds or 30 seconds, and then the chaos starts. That's when people start, screaming and moaning and carrying on. In that incident, there was a young lady by the name of Lily Clamens. I think she was in her early 30s and had 2 children. She was not part of our unit. She was part of the postal unit there, but I remember witnessing her on the ground, and one of our lieutenants was tending to her, and it's just really heartening to sit there and see some random act like this take lives. So that night, that was the largest mass casualty event in Baghdad, or maybe all of Iraq in 2007. The casualty count, I do believe, there was two fatalities for sure. I think there was about 30 casualties that night that people had to be tended to and taken care of. And Lily was a great gal, and I know that she had 2 daughters, and you know, it's really sad. Other accounts I had in Iraq, one of the projects that I took on myself is when you're in the middle of nowhere, you know, computer connectivity is really hard. So what I decided to do is I went to the people that laid fiber cable, and those guys were busy all the time. They couldn't come to Liberty Base Camp or Liberty Camp Liberty to do fiber projects. They were just too tied up. Well, we were an engineer battalion, so I took it upon myself and went to the operations people, and I said, hey, can you give me a couple guys with skid steers, you know, bobcats with trenchers on the front of them, and we'll run our own fiber. So I went to the materials section and talked to Lieutenant Colonel Bobby Jones and managed to get everything I needed and got the okay for the operations, and went to the people that took care of the fiber and said, hey, can I start a small project wiring people up here at Camp Liberty? So that's what we did. That's another thing I did is we started trenching. And so the motor pools were separate from, you know, like where the office space was at or where we lived. You know, it was maybe like a mile away. So we started trenching fiber optic cable. And when 2 pieces of pipe meet, or you needed to fuse fiber optic cable together, you would need to dig a pit for a concrete box to go in, so you could place some equipment there, or distribution point, like if you maybe want to make a T in the fiber. And funny thing is, so we're in the middle of the desert, right? So you start digging, and we would dig a hole maybe 5-6 foot deep to drop a concrete box in, and by morning it would be 3 foot of water in it. And everybody's like, I thought you were in the desert. You know, I'd take pictures of this and send it home. And what's funny about Victory Base Camp, so the Al-Fa Palace and everything's there, Saddam had dug a bunch of lakes out on this complex around his palaces. You know, a lot of them were surrounded with water, and, you know, that helped him with protection. And all that water was pumped out of the river, the Euphrates, over into the lakes, and then it would just seep through the ground into these holes. So then we had to mitigate that. But it's just funny to think that you're in the middle of the desert in Baghdad, you dig a hole, and then it's full of water the next morning. So a lot of one of the guys, Terrell Davis, delivered a lot of materials to us during this project, and unfortunately I got to come home on leave over Easter of 2008, and I came back, and Terrell had been hit by an IED and he perished during that, and I ended up being an investigating officer on that. And again, that was just a sad situation, and that was during the siege of Solder City, which is another thing that when I got back that we had to deal with. So basically, one of the worst places for insurgents to stay was Solder City, and how we took care of that. What the plan was to take these 12-foot T-walls. So you had all these bad guys in Solder City. Every time we'd go in there, bad things would happen. So we had to flush these people out. And how we flushed them out is with those 12-foot T-walls. We would build small communities within Solder City by putting in T-walls. So what you would do is you would probably have maybe 2 places within a couple block period, a couple block area where people could get in and out. So you could guard that area, and so people had to go through checkpoints. So we did this for all of Solder City, and that was called the Siege of Solder City. At that point in time, all the bad guys eventually left when they knew we were coming. The hard thing about that was when you're setting those T-walls down with a crane, you have to worry about, you got to climb a ladder and unhook the hook from the top of it, and that was the most dangerous job for those guys, was snipers, you know, obviously hitting them. So that did a lot of different things. That just kind of some memories of what took place over there.
Can you tell us about any memorable moments with Iraqi soldiers or citizens?
Sure, I interacted with the Iraqis quite a bit. We had some very young Iraqi boy. He was a Kurd. He's from it was a Kurd that had come down, and he was employed with us. We paid him to work in the material shop there, the engineer. So he was so pro-American. I mean, he wanted to become a U.S. citizen. He knew the language. He wanted to become a U.S. citizen. He wanted to become, go into special operations, be a Green Beret or Ranger, and come back. And he was just so pro-American and really believed in what we were doing there. And a lot of people that I talked to, one specific gentleman, he was a retired officer in the Iraqi Army. And we sat down and had a long talk. And what he explained to me is, he said that Saddam Hussein was a very vicious person, and his sons were even worse, Uday and Hussein. But he said it created an equilibrium and balance and power there between Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and that the problem is when we pulled him out, it created a huge void. And so he said, you've defeated the Iraqi army, which I was a part of. Now look what's going on. You've got insurgents coming in from other countries because they don't want you here. So you have to figure out a way to deal with this. And here we are in 2018, and they still have the same, we're not, you know, very small presence there, and it's the same thing. It's exactly what he predicted, is that if you don't stay with an iron fist, you'll be you're going to have problems. So anyway, I learned some things from different people. Obviously, disinformation was a bad thing. A lot of people had the wrong ideas about the United States. They thought we were, very, vicious, mean. That we were capturing people in the middle of the night and killing them and stuff like that. Things that probably that were not true at all.
So how long did you serve in the military, and what finally made you decide to leave the military?
I served for 27 years between active and National Guard time and reserve time, and basically I came back and got stationed at Fort Leonard Wood. I was the Deputy Brigade Commander for the 140th Regional Training Institute, a great organization, trained soldiers. And my father died that year, and it took a pretty big toll on me. And then soon after that, my mother-in-law died. And I really started thinking a lot about family, and did I spend enough time with my dad? Am I spending enough time with my children? And so I decided I put in 27 years, I made a good run, and I decided I would retire at that point in time.
Do you ever get back with the people you served with?
I absolutely love the people I served with. We had each other's back. Typically you have a battle buddy, and you do things like every 2 weeks you try to if you were my battle buddy, Zane, I'd be trying to put an IV in you every 2 weeks, just so I have practice of doing it, because it's my job to save your life. So we all had each other's backs, you know. We knew exactly where the best place to put that IV in if you got hit and needed it. Loved people to death. You know, unfortunately, we've never got together and had a reunion. Obviously, when I retired from the military, I have a civilian job. And I think in retirement, hopefully we'll get the opportunity to get out and see some of these people, and especially some of the soldiers that we lost. I'd like to check up on some of them's children and try to do a better job with that.
So what life lessons did you learn from the war?
One of the biggest lessons I learned is you have to earn the trust of the people. So we're going into a foreign country, and they have a lot of misconceptions about what the United States, what we're all about. And they've been told a lot of lies. So you have to build their trust. And once you build their trust, then you'll have their respect. And then once you have their respect, that's a point in time that hopefully peace will come around. So just being honest and trying to gain that trust is one of the most important things. And the other thing that I learned, if there's anything that I could tell our leaders of the United States, would be when you go to war, you have to think of an end state. So World War II, 60 or 60, 70 years out of World War II. We still have troops stationed in Germany, in Japan, and throughout the world because of that war. It gives us a projection of power, but also, it's created stability, and we spent a lot of money rebuilding those countries. So if I had anything to say to the leaders is, when you get into a conflict this big, and you have instability, or you have a vacuum. Remember we talked about taking Saddam out, so it leaves a vacuum in that country. So you've got other countries that can go in there and create chaos, so to speak. So if you destroy a country's infrastructure and rebuild it, you've got to think about the long-term commitment. How long are we going to stay here? So it's just things to think about, and with that is the loss of U.S. life and the loss of soldiers. So it's a very tough job, being the president and deciding, whether you're going to go to war or not.
Colonel Branson, thank you for your time served, and thanks for allowing us to share your story.
All right, thank you guys for interviewing me.